Hello again, 102. In this video, we will conclude the civil rights movement of the 1960s and some of the divisions that emerged. And Alabama was a state presided over by a feisty new racist governor, George Wallace, who had vowed to protect segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. King knew that demonstrations in Birmingham would likely provoke violence, but a hard-won victory there, he felt, would build national support and break the back of segregation all over the nation by revealing Southern brutality openly in the light of day, with the rest of the world looking on through television cameras. And the Birmingham campaign began with sit-ins at restaurants, picket lines at segregated businesses, and a march on City Hall. The police arrested and jailed the activists. Each day, however, more demonstrators, black and white, joined the efforts, and as King and others led demonstrations through Birmingham streets in April, the all-white police force, led by Bull Connor, using snarling dogs, as we saw at the end of the other video, tear gas, electric cattle prods, and fire hoses were turned on the protesters. And millions of Americans across the nation were outraged when they saw the ugly confrontations on television. And the civil rights movement, President Kennedy observed, owes Bull Connor as much as it owes Abraham Lincoln. It also owed a lot to the power of television, which brought the savagery of racism into millions of American homes. And more than 3,000 demonstrators were arrested in Birmingham, including Dr. King. And while he was in jail, he wrote a letter from a Birmingham jail, a stirring defense of nonviolent civil disobedience, which has since become a classic document of the civil rights movement. One who breaks an unjust law, King stressed, must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. King's efforts prevailed when Birmingham officials finally agreed to end their segregationist practices. So this is defined, again, this is the tactic of the first half of the 1960s. And throughout the Lower South, whites defied efforts at racial integration. And on June 11, 1963, the Alabama governor, Wallace, personally blocked the door at the University of Alabama as African American students tried to register for classes. Wallace finally stepped aside in the face of insistent federal marshals and army troops. That night, President Kennedy told the nation he was urging Congress to pass a major new civil rights bill. Yet Southern Democrats in the Congress blocked Kennedy's civil rights bill. And then comes the famous I Have a Dream, the height of the nonviolent civil disobedience movement. And this is blocked a little bit here by my face. This is King at the mall on Washington in front of the Lincoln Memorial, facing the Washington Monument, and 250,000 people attended this rally. And this makes the nonviolent civil disobedience movement nationwide. And the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was the largest political demonstration in American history. The organizers, primarily civil rights veterans like Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, who we mentioned back in the New Deal era, never imagined that so many people would participate. And when you looked at the crowd, remember the U.S. Park Service Ranger, you didn't see blacks or whites, you saw America. Prominent entertainers like Mahalia Jackson, Marian Anderson, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, Odetta, and Peter, Paul, and Mary sang protest songs, and civil rights activists gave speeches calling for racial justice. Then something remarkable happened. 34-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. spoke, and he began awkwardly, and noticing his nervousness, someone on stage urged him to tell him about the dream. And he started slowly and picked up speed as if he were preaching at a revival, giving poetic voice to the hopes of millions as he stressed the fierce urgency of now and the unstoppable power of meeting physical force with soul force. And President Kennedy, watching on television, told an aide that he's damn good. And Dr. King then shared his dream of an America in which racism would be put on a path to extinction, and the ideal, it's always in the background in American history, ladies and gentlemen, the ideal of equality would be realized. In spite of the difficulties and frustrations of the moment, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. So let freedom ring, he shouted, for when we let freedom ring from every town and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up the day when all God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to hold hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. But King's dream of ending racial violence remained just that, a dream deferred. 18 days after the March on Washington, 4 Klansmen in Birmingham detonated a bomb in a black church, killing 4 young girls. And the awful murder sparked indignation across the country and around the world. The editors of the Milwaukee Sentinel stressed that Birmingham bombing should serve to goad the conscience. The deaths, in a sense, are on the hands of each of us. And the Warren Court will help speed the process of integration up through many of their court cases that expanded the rights of individuals in the 1960s. More on that in Political Science 110, from Gideon and the right to an attorney in felony cases, and Escobedo, the rights of the individual and the criminal when he is arrested, and finally the Miranda warnings that are developed out of that case will greatly help increase civil rights. And Freedom Summer developed throughout late 1963 and 64 after Kennedy was assassinated. The movement grew in scope, visibility, and power. Racism, however, remained entrenched in the Lower South, and they will attempt to have African American voter registration drives, and they will establish the freedom schools in the Deep South, and this is cut off a little bit, and it will be a chance for black students to learn during the summer. And many of these recruits for what came to be called Freedom Summer were idealistic white college students, and many were Jewish. So Mississippi's white leaders prepared for the nigger communist invasion by doubling the state police force and stockpiling tear gas, cattle prods, and shotguns. Then in June 1964, Klan members abducted and murdered 3 young civil rights workers, James Earl Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Mickey Schwerner. And this is the famous Hollywood movie Mississippi Burning that came out in the late 90s. Their decomposed bodies were found 2 months later in a cattle pond. And in the process of searching for the missing men, authorities found the bodies of 8 black males in rivers and swamps. The murders, said one volunteer, were the end of innocence, after which things could never be the same. And in the mid-60s, it moves from civil rights to black power. Racism was never limited solely to the South, and as you see by these white terrorists, they want to exterminate blacks as they're going through a riot zone in Chicago. King and others acknowledged privately that many young blacks, especially those in large cities, were losing faith in the strategy of nonviolence. And on August 11, 1965, when Watts, the largest ghetto in Los Angeles, exploded in a frenzy of rioting and looting, and when this uprising ended, 34 were dead and almost 4,000 were in jail, and the property damage exceeded $35 million. Chicago and Cleveland, along with 40 other American cities, experienced similar race riots in the summer of 1966. The following summer, Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan burst into flames. Between 1965 and 1968, nearly 300 racial uprisings shattered the peace of urban America, and that will lead to the revival of Richard M. Nixon and the law and order and the silent majority. More on that in coming chapters. The racial violence in northern cities revealed a civil war within the civil rights movement. And the Black Power movement, which was a militant form of civil rights protest focused on urban communities in the North, emerged as a response to the impatience with the nonviolent tactics of Martin Luther King Jr. And Malcolm X was the most influential spokesman, and his militant message conflicted with MLK's emphasis on nonviolence. And there's a nice picture of Malcolm X. He spent 7 years in a Massachusetts prisons. He dropped out of school in 9th grade, and while he was in prison, he experienced a conversion, and he joined a small Chicago-based religious sect called the Nation of Islam, whose members were called Black Muslims. And the organization had little to do with Islam and everything to do with the dominating leader, Elijah Muhammad, and a cult-like devotion he required. Muhammad dismissed whites as devils and championed black nationalism, racial pride, self-respect, and self-discipline. And by 1953, a year after leaving prison, Malcolm X was a full-time Nation of Islam minister, famous for his electrifying speeches attacking white racism and black powerlessness. And more than most black leaders, Malcolm X expressed the emotions and frustrations of inner-city African-American working poor. Yet, at the peak of his influence, Malcolm X became embroiled in a conflict with Elijah Muhammad that proved fatal. Nation of Islam assassins killed Malcolm X in Manhattan, New York, on February the 21st, 1965. Black militancy did not die with Malcolm X, however. When Stokely Carmichael, a 25-year-old graduate of Howard University, became the head of the Students' Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he enforced the separatist philosophy of Black Power by ousting whites from the organization. When you talk of Black Power, Carmichael shouted, you talk of bringing this country to its knees, of building a movement that will smash everything Western civilization has created. And then Carmichael and others like H. Rap Brown will move on and found the Black Panthers here outside of a San Francisco Liberation School. And there were two good things that came out of the Black Power movement. It forced King and other mainstream black leaders and organizations to shift their focus from the rural South to the poverty-stricken inner-city ghettos in the North and West. And that will culminate in King's People's Movement for Economic Equality in 1967. And second, the controversial Black Power movement also motivated African Americans to take greater pride in their racial heritage by pushing for Black studies programs in schools and colleges, to celebrate African cultural and artistic traditions, and to organize inner-city voters to elect black mayors, and laws forcing landlords to treat blacks fairly, and the creation of grassroots organizations and community centers in black neighborhoods. It was Malcolm X who insisted that blacks call themselves African Americans as a symbol of pride in their roots and as a spur to learn more about their history. And as the black popular singer James Brown urged, say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud.